So today we're going to be talking about REST API frameworks written in Python. Now there's a lot of solutions that we're going to go through today. Each have different pros and cons, different use cases, and hopefully you can find a good one to make use of in your next project. Now the first one that we're going to be talking about is probably the most popular framework for writing backends in Python, and that is the Django framework. Now the big pro of Django is that it is an extremely opinionated framework, and that can be both a pro and a con. On the pro side, it is incredibly robust in its architecture. It comes with its own sets of things. It has its own ORM, and you don't really need to make any decisions on how to structure a Django project. It's all really there for you. However, that opinionated nature is something that could be a huge downside. For example, let's say you don't really know the scope of your project. Let's say that you want it to be very flexible. That's not really something that Django is going to provide you. You have to use their things. You have to work within their rules. And that's great because maybe it offers you a lot less room for error. If you're a newer developer, if you're not used to handling things like authorization out of the box, Django comes with a lot of that stuff built in and it's ready to go, right? However, if it's your first time learning, let's say a Python backend framework, Django is something that's going to look a lot more daunting than, let's say, their alternatives, which are microframeworks. And that brings us on to our next one, which is Flask. Now Flask is the second most popular backend framework for Python, and their entire thing is that they are not Django. They're the complete opposite of Django in every way. Whereas Django is very robust, it's structured, it's kind of a monolith in the way that it's set up. Flask is very lightweight, very straightforward, and you can get started with a Flask app in about 7 lines of code, if not a little bit less. This is their hello world. Basically, you send a request to the default endpoint, and then you get the response of hello world. And you can just run that using Python 3-m flask run, and there you go, there's your server. Now this is really good for something that is newer. Let's say that you don't really know where your project is going. Let's say that you want something lightweight and flexible. That's really the direction that you'd want to go with this micro framework. It is something that has a much lower learning curve than Django. This is going to look super intimidating when you first open up a Django app. When you open up a Flask app, it is something that if you know Python, you can pretty much get what's going on. In contrast, if you go to the Django intro site, you'll find that creating a project is a little bit more complicated. You're using this start project thing. You get all these things you don't really know. You get ascii.py, wsgi.py, settings, etc. It's not a grab and go thing in the way that Flask is. However, a lot of these things down the road will be extremely advantageous. Now the flexibility is really a great positive with Flask because Django is going to assume a lot about your architecture. For example, Django uses server-side rendered HTML templates, right? And that assumes a certain thing about your architecture. Let's say that you're using a SPA framework like a React, Angular, or a Vue. Although you could plug that into Django, it's not really set up to do that out of the box. Whereas Flask, because there's so little there, it makes perfect sense to plug it into a SPA framework. Now there's a glaring issue with both of these, and it's that they are built on something called WSGI, which is really what allows Python to act as a server, right? And the problem with WSGI is that it predates concurrency in Python, right? What exactly is concurrency and why is it so important? Concurrency at its core is something that lets you do almost 2 things at once in single-threaded languages like JavaScript and Python. I'm giving you an example in JavaScript because the syntax is a little bit cleaner, but the concept applies exactly the same. Now, if you're coming from Python and you're not used to using concurrency, you would expect that when you have something before something else, it runs in order. Ideally, you would do this getData function, it would execute the whole thing, and then it would run this hello world. But an asynchronous function works a little bit different. What it will do is it will begin executing this. While it's waiting for the response, it will execute this console.log, and then when this finishes up, it will console.log it. And that is what async await empowers you to do. And if we do our node main.js, you will see that we got our hello world before our console.log user.data. Now, how is this relevant and how does this help you build out a backend? If you're writing a server, the majority of what you're doing is waiting. You're either waiting from a response from your database, you're maybe calling another API, another microservice, etc. You're generally waiting, and do you really want to be blocking threads while you're waiting for other things to happen? Now, if you use a WSGI-based framework, let's say you're using Django and WSGI, or you're using Flask, then you're not really getting the major benefit out of that async await. It kind of predates that. However, if you're using FastAPI, none of this is thread blocking at all, and you can use async await in the same way that you would use it in JavaScript without any configuration. Now this is FastAPI. It's kind of a larger example here, but in flavor, it's pretty similar to Flask. In just a couple of lines of code, you're launching your app and you're good to go. However, unlike Flask, it comes with a lot of goodies. You'll notice that FastAPI auto-documents itself. You can see each of your routes, you can add information as to what a proper request is, and if your request is slightly incorrect, it'll give you that warning right away. Now also, if you go to -docs, you'll get something called a Swagger UI that allows you to send requests to your individual routes with explanations as to what they do, parameters, etc. It's a really powerful tool. The whole concept behind this is to conform to something called the Open API specifications, which are a list of rules and standards for structuring APIs, and one of those includes auto documentation as well as some sort of interface that allows you to request your individual endpoints. Okay, so that concludes our rundown. Hopefully that gives you a bit more guidance as to what Python framework you should choose for your next project. If you like the content, please like, subscribe. It really supports the channel, and thank you very much.